Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Taimur Shamil. In a major development, the Taliban and the Afghan government announced on Wednesday that they have agreed on a three-page agreement which is going to lay down the foundation of further peace talks and intra-Afghan talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. This is unprecedented. This is for the first time that they have agreed on a major framework, a basic framework for peace talks. This year has seen unprecedented violence in Afghanistan. In the past, Taliban have been carrying out attacks on government installations. Some terrorist organizations have also been attacking innocent people in Afghanistan. ISIS, TTP, Jamaat al-Ahrar, Hezbollah Ahrar, these are the terrorist organizations that have been operating in Afghanistan. The major concern for the regional countries is the peace and stability of Afghanistan, the security situation in Afghanistan. And as we are talking about this agreement, for the people of Afghanistan, it is important that there should be ceasefire and there should be reduction of violence in Afghanistan. Dignitaries around the world have hailed this development. US envoy Zalmay Khalilzad has appreciated the agreement that the both sides have reached. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi has also appreciated and hailed the agreement that is reached between the Taliban and the Afghan government. But the basic question is about the future of Afghan government, about the future of Ghani administration for that matter. Many people are of the view that President Ghani perhaps in the past was not very willing for the peace talks or the US deal with the Taliban that was signed in February. And from then onward, probably some factions in the Afghan government have been reluctant to sign a deal with the Taliban, even when they were talking about the release of the Taliban prisoners for that matter. Also, that Abdullah has been primarily pushing the efforts for peace in Afghanistan. We'll talk about this and the future of Afghan government, the future of peace and stability in Afghanistan, and the future of Pakistan-Afghanistan relations. Recently, a few days back, Prime Minister Imran Khan visited Afghanistan, Kabul. That was his maiden trip, and he categorically mentioned that Pakistan and Afghanistan would do anything that would ensure peace and stability in Afghanistan, and that both countries are looking for cooperation. But Pakistan's main concerns are the terrorist organizations operating from Afghanistan and carrying out attacks inside Pakistan. TTP, Jamaat al-Ahrar, and Hezbollah Ahrar, along with ISIS, are the main concerns, the main terrorist organizations which have been targeting the innocent Afghan people and the innocent Pakistani people. We're going to discuss about this with our special guest. We are joined by Adam Weinstein. He's a renowned expert on Afghan affairs. He's also a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Had a wide experience in Afghanistan. Welcome to the program, Mr. Weinstein. We are joined by Mr. Tariq Farhadi, renowned expert on Afghanistan, and was also the former advisor to the former Afghan President Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan. And welcome you both. I'll start my question with Mr. Farhadi, talking about this deal first of all. How do you see this basic agreement that is reached between the Taliban and the Afghan government? What is the future now of the intra-Afghan talks, and how do you see the Ghani administration, their approach towards specifically this agreement and their own future?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on Pakistan TV World and to be speaking with my brothers and sisters in Pakistan and with yourself.
Thank you. Most welcome.
It has been a difficult process as you have been following it. The Taliban have not diminished in size. They have not diminished in the type of violence that they are exacting on the Afghan people. I'm sure you see the images of the bombings in Kabul, everywhere in the country. Civilians really victims of this war, children, journalists. I know you're a journalist. You would be sensitive to that. The situation in Afghanistan is very, very difficult. The government, unfortunately, has not had enough support outside the big cities. and this is one of the reasons why the Taliban have not disappeared. Because if the government had support outside the big cities, the Taliban would not be able to survive society, basically. But the fact that they are there and they are a reality brings us to the conclusion that the government, although helped by the international community and also supported militarily, has been struggling, to be frank, to win over the Taliban.
Right.
Military specialists say that there is no side winning this war. Neither the Taliban will win, neither the government will win, but with time, violence is going to take the lives of the people who are not in armored cars or in well-guarded palaces. So here we have a situation where the continuation of this situation, the cost of it is paid by the civilians in Afghanistan. Nobody wants that. I'm sure our sisters and brothers in Pakistan also would like to see Afghanistan in peace, because I would like to talk later about the opportunities for a peaceful Afghanistan, how it can be good for Pakistan as well.
Right. Mr. Fardi, please stay with us. Mr. Weinstein, talking about the future of this deal, let's say, the future of intra-Afghan talks, how do you see it? And most importantly, the future of Ghani administration, because many people, Afghan experts, are of the view that probably President Ghani wasn't very much happy with the intra-Afghan deal, probably with the US-Taliban deal primarily. And so how do you see the future of Ghani administration and the future of this intra-Afghan talks?
Well, thanks for having me. Talks like these are always difficult. It's not surprising that it's taken them this long just to come up with rules and procedures, although I do think some of the movement has to do with the uncertainty of what the Biden administration must do. And what I mean by that is I think, the assurance of indefinite presence by U.S. troops actually deters compromise on the part of the Afghan government, even though it provides their negotiators some leverage over the Taliban. So it's a double-edged sword. And I do think the negotiators realize that the U.S. is leaving. I'm not sure President Ghani has reconciled himself with that reality yet. I think President Ghani views a U.S. departure or even an interim agreement as an existential threat to his political career. I don't think he sees an outcome, even if there's an interim government or any kind of political settlement in which he retains power. In fact, I think he might think that he has to flee the country. And I think that's the elephant in the room. So it's not surprising when I read reports that the Ghani administration is not being completely cooperative with talks. That being said, that doesn't excuse the reign of terror that the Taliban has taken and the escalations in violence in Helmand and Kandahar and in Kabul. I think the Taliban are most responsible for the slow progress of these talks. But Ghani receives support from the United States. The Afghan government receives support from international partners, and it's unacceptable if the Ghani administration is not taking these talks seriously. So I think it's possible to achieve a settlement, but it's going to require real progress by both the Taliban and the Kabul government, and that's difficult.
That's difficult, right. Mr. Fardi, while we talk about the intra-Afghan talks and the future of it, the main concern for, I think, the Taliban and the US is the withdrawal of the US forces from Afghanistan. That is very important for the Taliban. Probably that is very also, to some extent, important for the Afghan administration. How do you see that? The reports are that probably the President-elect Biden is going to keep some sort of US troops presence in Afghanistan. Would that be acceptable to the Taliban? Can we go on with this kind of agreement, let's say?
Well, it will be a matter of negotiation with the Taliban. The Taliban have justified and continued their war in the last, let's say, 16 years, saying that they are fighting against occupation. And President Trump had almost promised them that he will exit Afghanistan. So then the Taliban would have achieved their goal, which was the end of occupation, quote unquote, because Kabul doesn't see it as occupation. Because the US troops came to Afghanistan with a coalition based on a resolution of the United Nations 18 years ago. But that's the past. Now, if President-elect Biden takes the file, takes a look, thinks that he would like to stay for a bit longer, and that's why the Americans announced yesterday that 2 of the bases will be kept, the larger bases. Of course, it can be explained to the Taliban that we are leaving 2,500 people to protect our embassy and foreign embassies. So under this explanation, the Taliban might agree to a very limited US presence in Afghanistan. But in exchange, the Taliban will seek also some sort of interim setup for the government where they are going to be part of the power as well. Because they have to, if they agree to something, they have to obtain something in this negotiation, and they have to be able to explain it to their fighters on the ground. Estimates vary that there is between 60,000 and 100,000 Taliban fighters. It is only under an interim setup where some of the Taliban will come and participate in the power structure that there could be a future for these fighters to give up fighting or to become part of the Afghan army, or whatever it is that it will be. It's up for negotiation. But the Taliban, in order to explain that to their troops, they have to also explain that the Americans left, except for a very small contingent that is protecting the American embassy and Western embassies.
Right, right. And Mr. Weinstein, what's your take on this? The US troops in Afghanistan, many people think that Taliban are negotiating with a point of strength, with a position of strength. They control massive parts of Afghanistan. Probably the Afghan government is not strong in many parts. They are having a deal, a negotiation with the United States and now with the Afghan government, having kind of a setup in which they would agree to give, let's say, or share power with the Afghan government and then also allow the US troops in Afghanistan. How does it sound? How do you see it?
Well, most U.S. embassies around the world have a contingent of U.S. Marines that provide security. I think all but one has security. But I don't think that's what we're talking about. I think what we're talking about is whether there'll be a residual force or not. And I don't think a significant residual force would be acceptable to the Taliban or necessarily beneficial for U.S. interests, because there's a risk of mission creep and a risk of being drawn into a civil conflict. But I do agree with Mr. Farhadi that the negotiations in many ways amount to semantics over the terminology of things. There's real points of disagreement that are significant, but there's also some semantics involved over whether Afghanistan will be called an Islamic Republic or not, whether U.S. troops at the embassy amount to, continued U.S. presence or not, and some of that will come down to semantics and basically finding a compromise that allows all sides to save some face. The Taliban are fighting from a position of strength. That's just a fact. We can talk about safe havens in Pakistan. We can talk about foreign support for the Taliban. But the fact is, Mr. Farhadi was correct when he essentially made the argument, I believe, that Kabul and the Ghani administration has a legitimacy problem, especially in the south and the east. That's just a fact. There's a legitimacy problem on the ground. The fact that the Taliban receive outside support is one issue, but the Afghan government receives outside support. neither the government nor the Taliban are standing completely on their own. But there was a legitimacy vacuum that was provided due to some early mistakes by the Afghan government and by the U.S. military in deprived parts of the country. So I do think the Taliban are negotiating from a position of strength, but I also don't think it's in their interest for the country to descend into a civil war. So we'll have to see. There's a narrative that the Taliban only will accept complete control. That might be true among some factions within Taliban leadership, but I think there's other factions that do genuinely want to negotiate. I don't know what the Taliban will do. I don't think anyone knows. I think it's very difficult to understand their strategic thinking.
Right.
So I will have to wait and see.
Right, right. And Mr. Farhadi, do you see in the future, let's say, while these intra-Afghan talks continue, some sort of, let's say, agreement on power sharing, some sort of interim government, but probably that doesn't exist in the present Afghan constitution? How do you see that?
There has to be a power sharing agreement. This war can only end with a power sharing agreement. And I think these talks in Doha, what the tweets that we see from here and there talks about a roadmap. The Afghan side is asking for a ceasefire. The Taliban are asking for an Islamic government. But in fact, both of these people, what they mean is they have to get some of what they want. So I don't see a ceasefire immediately because the Taliban have not gotten what they wanted, which is part of the power. For the Afghan population, I speak today to the Pakistani population and I speak on behalf of the Afghan population. We want peace. If the price of peace is to bring the Taliban inside the government, fine, because we are not here to defend a certain person's presidency or a certain person's continuation of power. We are here at this point to bring the level of violence down, as I had mentioned at the beginning. We are here to go towards peace. For peace, there is a give and take, and elements of the Constitution will be up for negotiation. It is a war. Nobody wins the war. If anybody had won the war, they would have won in the last 2 decades. If Kabul had won the war, they would have won it when the full presence of the United States was with them. It didn't happen. So now we have to take a step back and accept the reality that this war, after the foreign troops leave Afghanistan, could become a very ugly civil war inside Afghanistan. And as civilians, we have a role to step up and avoid that. There's on one side the Taliban, harsh in their what they want. There's another side, a government which is struggling to keep legitimacy, with all kinds of corruption problem, etc. So we have to find a middle way. We have to find a neutral third party who comes in, and they could be Afghans, and say, look, neither will you get fully what you want, Taliban, neither will you get fully what you want, Mr. Ghani, but we have to now have an interim administration composed of some technocrats who can manage the delivery of services, health, education, IDPs. We have internally displaced people. As you know, we have refugees in Pakistan, and we have had them for decades. And the return of the refugees, all of that needs to be managed. So the Taliban should be part of the government, a number of technocrats who can come and bring reforms to a government that has been recognized as corrupt by the world. Because when the world met in Geneva last week, they said, we can help you, but if you stop corruption. So that was one of the conditions. So a new team is needed. that could accommodate the Taliban, that could accommodate some elements of the Ghani administration, but I don't think Mr. Ghani can stay as president. The Taliban would not accept it.
Right, right. Interesting. Mr. Weinstein, recently ISIS has been carrying out attacks in Afghanistan. It has also targeted people in Pakistan for that matter. In Afghanistan, we have seen that ISIS has been carrying out attacks on a Sikh temple, on a maternity ward for that matter, at Kabul University and other places, primarily targeting innocent people in Afghanistan. As well as in Pakistan, ISIS has been carrying out attacks on Sufi shrines, schools and colleges. So ISIS is a main concern for Pakistan and Afghanistan, along with TTP, Jamaat-ul-Ahrar and Hizbul-Ahrar. What is the future, let's say, how do you see the future of counter-terrorism cooperation between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and the way US has been, let's say, supporting, let's say, this counter-terrorism activity? How do you see it?
Well, first, I just want to mention something that Mr. Farhadi said, which he referenced the donors conference in which international donors conditioned aid on robust anti-corruption measures that I don't think the government in Afghanistan will achieve anytime soon, which indicates that international donors want an out from Afghanistan if progress is not made. This is an ability for them to walk away if they see the situation deteriorate. And I think that should be a wake-up call for the government in Afghanistan. To answer your specific question, ISIS is an enemy of the Taliban. It's an enemy of the United States. It's an enemy of Pakistan. That is what makes that's a positive fact for the counterterrorism campaign. In fact, there was a report that suggested that the United States military was indirectly providing air support for Taliban assaults on ISIS in Afghanistan. I can't speak to the validity of that report, but ISIS is a common enemy. TTP, there's also a risk of a resurgence. In fact, it's already happening. I think Pakistan's threat calculation is a little bit off. I think Pakistan views it as a proxy. That might be true to an extent, but I also do think, unfortunately, due to the deteriorating situation in Waziristan, it's possible that TTP could get some domestic support within those areas. So I think that's a reality that the Pakistani state has to grapple with. Obviously, this war has taken a toll for both Afghanistan, the United States, and Pakistan. The biggest victims have been Afghan civilians. Pakistan has also taken casualties and losses. In fact, last week, I think, was the 9-year anniversary of the Salalah incident, in which 24 Pakistani troops lost their lives. And I won't litigate the details of what caused that incident, but the fact is 24 Pakistani soldiers lost their lives, and thousands of Pakistani civilians have lost their lives. So the counterterrorism relationship is going to be very important going forward, especially after a U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's going to make cooperation between Pakistan and the United States and a potential Afghan government even more important, because there won't be a presence of U.S. troops inside the country. So I think it's going to be a difficult road ahead, but it's something that has to be achieved.
Right, right. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Mr. Farhadi, pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. Mr. Weinstein, thank you for joining us. Pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you.
We were talking about the situation in Afghanistan, the political situation in Afghanistan. The Taliban and the Afghan government, they have reached an agreement. A 3-page agreement was signed between the Taliban and the Afghan government. The major thing, the takeaway is the ceasefire between the Taliban and the Afghan government. Afghanistan has seen unprecedented violence in the last couple of months. ISIS has been carrying out devastating attacks on the civilian population in Afghanistan, and that probably is a common foe for the regional countries and for the Afghan government as well as for the Taliban. So counterterrorism efforts are the most important, I would say, most important thing that needs to be addressed in Afghanistan. We'll take a break, and after the break we are going to discuss about DG ISPR's interview with Global Village Space, in which he mentioned about the 5th generation warfare. We're also going to discuss about the Indian dossier By the way, that was presented by Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi and DG ISPR a few days back at a press conference at Foreign Office. The press conference was damning with a lot of actionable evidence of Indian involvement in Afghanistan, instigating and provoking terrorist organizations in Afghanistan to carry out attacks on Pakistan. We'll be discussing about that with our special guest after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back. In a recent interview, DG ISPR General Iftikhar Babar mentioned the fifth generation warfare that Pakistan is fighting against the misinformation primarily, and a war that is imposed by India using all the misinformation and disinformation against Pakistan. A few days back, DG ISPR and Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi they did a press conference, and in that specific press conference they mentioned details about how India has been using proxies in Afghanistan against Pakistan, how India has been using bank transactions, the way they have been funding the terrorist organizations. They even mentioned about the Indian officials, diplomats as well as army personnel based in India and based in Afghanistan for that matter, who have been instigating and supporting the terrorist organizations from there to target Pakistan. Other than that, DG ISPR also talked about the security situation in the region. He talked about fencing the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and also Pakistan and Iran. For Pakistan, the most important thing at the moment is peace and stability in Afghanistan, and also securing its areas along with the Afghanistan border and with the Iran border. In the past, we have seen several attacks on the army personnel, several attacks on the innocent people in Pakistan, along the Pak-Afghan border and also along the Pak-Iran border for that matter. We'll be discussing about DG ISPR's press interview with the Global Village Space, a think tank, a magazine based in Islamabad, and the salient points of this discussion, and most importantly, the fifth generation warfare, the propaganda from the Indian side, and a couple of other things. With our special guests, we are joined by Lieutenant General retired Naeem Lodhi, former Defence Minister and a renowned senior defence analyst. So, welcome to the program. We are also joined by Professor Dr. Zafar Nawaz Jaspal, renowned senior academic an expert on international relations and national security. I welcome Dr. Jaspal. General Lodi, starting with specifically the fifth generation warfare. Not the first time that the Pakistani officials have talked about this, but specifically in this interview, DG ISPR, Major General Iftikhar Baba, he talked about the fifth generation warfare. While Pakistan is tackling with a couple of challenges, the region rather I would say is tackling with challenges of a war that has been going on in Afghanistan, proxy wars in Afghanistan for that matter, and COVID-19. In this situation, fifth generation warfare, how do you see it, and Indian involvement in all these things?
Thank you very much. Just for the benefit of your audience and those who want to learn a bit of terminologies, fifth generation warfare basically deals with cyber warfare, information warfare, disinformation warfare, media warfare, propaganda warfare, and things like that. Actually, hybrid war is a more encompassing term in which fourth generation is also included, which is more about low intensity conflicts using proxies, surgical operations, and all such things. So I think mostly because we have to agree on certain terms once we are speaking, as Aristotle said. So let us talk about hybrid war more, which also contains fifth generation war and fourth generation war and maybe some other. So actually, once we say that we are a victim of hybrid war, it means that you have some kinetics also involved, you have media involved, you have economy involved, you have politics involved. So this is the whole encompassing thing, which is hybrid war. I think DGISPR pointed out very clearly, and it is based on the evidence that has been collected, and that folder has been shared by everyone wherever it was required. So we are now very clear that what Indians are doing. And I think this folder that we have presented, that should give us a very good ground to actually tell us what we should be doing in return. Because diplomacy alone will not really mend the ways or bend Modi's attitude or Indian attitude. And I don't think that because of these folders, much pressure is going to come on India to which it can succumb, like from United States or from UK or some economic sanctions and all that. There can be certain statements, and that is about all. So the only, I think, good purpose of presenting all this could be, in my opinion, that we can tell the world that now this is what is happening to us. So do not blame us if we exercise our right to respond. And that is more important. And I think that is the whole issue that needs to be discussed.
Right. Professor Jaspal, talking about this interview, and not just the interview. As I mentioned earlier, a few days back, Foreign Minister and DG ISPR both did a press conference, and they mentioned exactly the name of the Indian officials who have been involved in instigating terrorism and supporting terrorism from Afghanistan, using the Afghan soil against Pakistan. Now, Pakistan has been pretty, I would say, after this press conference, and not probably for the first time, this has been happening in the past as well, but Pakistan is proactively now exposing India on different platforms. The Indian dossier, as we call it, was handed over to the Secretary General of United Nations. That was also brought up with the Afghan ambassador here in Islamabad. So this proactive approach, would you call it a proactive approach? How do you see this?
I think that it's the right step in the right direction, because if you see that Pakistan has been highlighting, and Pakistan is also a victim of the terrorism. And India has been lobbying to keep Pakistan in the grey list and move it into the blacklist at a FATF. And in the February, after coming 2 months, 3 months, there will be a more lobbying. I think that Pakistan adopted a correct policy by highlighting the Indian terrorism to sensitize the international community, especially through the International United Nations Forum, that what India has been doing and what the Indian officials are, how the Indian officials have been using the Afghan soil against Pakistan. With this highlighting, definitely we are building our case against India, and we have to fight with India on all the different fronts, including the what we call it military front, but diplomatic. And this, in the modern time, this narrative, or you can say maligning tactics against one another, they are often faced. So by this way, of course, our tactic is not a maligning India, but exposing the Indian policies. Unfortunately, at the moment, the international community, especially Western world led by the United States, is too much inclined towards the India. But definitely, when we bring this, there are 193 countries in the world, and this realignment has been taking place, and now one can see how the Chinese have been thinking, how the Russians have been thinking, and besides that, when you talk about this state-sponsored terrorism, not only within Kashmir but inside Pakistan, and it's an open secret. Entire world knows it. But when we are hammering this issue, definitely it will be in the advantage of Pakistan diplomatic, you can say, proactivism against India.
Right, right. Very interesting. Very interesting. Professor Jaspal, please stay with us on phone call. General Lodhi, this point is very important raised by Professor Jaspal, that there is also going to be, probably in the past, narratives have been played out by the world powers, by other countries as well. We have been also using narratives, specifically, let's say, narratives on war on terror, the way, let's say, US has been criticizing China-Pakistan economic corridor, some of the US officials for that matter, BK agreement of US with India. So all these things, these actions are wrapped up in narratives, as we are discussing about fifth generation warfare. Countering these narratives and projecting Pakistan's own narrative, how do you see that? A need for a grand narrative for Pakistan?
I think the one thing we must acknowledge that Pakistan has created a narrative, and a very effective one, about Kashmir, about Afghanistan, acknowledging our efforts, so which means that our narrative is succeeding. About Kashmir, I think two major differences have been made. One, that the entire world knows now that the nature of problem as far as Kashmir is concerned. And
Right.
secondly, they also know that the indigenous resistance movement has nothing to do with terrorism. I think these narratives have spread well. But my dear, the problem is that narratives are always built and spread and they used to make a ground for something else, for some political action, for some lawfare, for some military action. Because narrative alone cannot win you the objectives. So if Pakistan has certain objectives, which definitely we have very effectively built counter narratives. And I think now if India can shout at the top of their voice, nobody is going to listen to them that Pakistan is harboring any terrorist or Pakistan is supporting any terrorism. I think that myth has been busted. And that is, I think, one big success, thumping success, which our Foreign Office and our narrative has achieved. We must acknowledge that. But I must add hastily that this alone will not get you to your objective, will not get you what you want. So you have to also act in other fields. For example, lawfare we have done. We have started. This folder is one step, but probably the only step so far. There are so many other things we can do. Whatever is happening in Kashmir, we should get more knowledge about the units who are doing it and the people who are perpetrating it, and then take it to the higher courts. We can do many things politically, as we are doing in Gilgit-Baltistan, to give them a conditional status of a province. We can do the same for Azad Kashmir. We can ask UN to hold a partial plebiscite in Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. If they refuse that, which is very likely, we should then go for a referendum and call all the international observers to come and see what the people of this area want, which can be later on extended to the Indian occupied Kashmir. We can have government in exile. We can have so many other things. But this narrative alone is a theoretical thing. It gives you a playing field where you have to play other options, as I am just mentioning. So unless we do that, this narrative alone will not get you anywhere.
Right, right. And Professor Jaspal, it's a realist world. So in realpolitik, what is the scope of the dossier, the Indian dossiers that we have been providing, and also the way we have been exposing India on different platforms to the Secretary General of the United Nations, to the Afghan ambassador here in Islamabad, and generally, how do you see the scope of the dossier, the scope of countering this misinformation?
Look, this is an important point here. There are many options, and you have to utilize many options at one time. While exercising those options, we are able to accomplish our objectives. This sharing of the dossier with the United Nations and with the Afghan ambassador and with the rest of the world, definitely it's very important. We have to understand at this moment in the United States, new administration is coming, and the Democrats are very much, you can say, talking about the values. Though they will be not going to change their dimension, what the Indo-US strategic partnership is there, but at the same time, one needs to sensitize the world. In this changing world, if we cannot highlight these kind of the things what the Indians have been doing, then who will highlight? Definitely we have to highlight, because we are the sufferer of the Indian state-sponsored terrorism, not only in the Indian occupied Kashmir, but in the Pakistan as well. It's our responsibility to highlight, and definitely we have to talk with the Afghanistan, because Afghan government has always been asking us that we can do something more or alleging us, but if you are sharing the facts and figures with them, definitely it will give a strength to our foreign office. So look, the diplomacy always requires these kind of the initiatives, these kind of the things, and then again, if you see that India and Pakistan is a standstill, and the world must realize that these kind of the sub-conventional warfare, if India is using against Pakistan, definitely Pakistan then has a right to use it. Then Indians cannot, if Indians can, you can say, highlight or erroneously present very adequately by the wrong, you can say, facts, and try to malign our institutions, our government, our country, our people. Similarly, you have to pay them in the same coin. My understanding is that this dossier is very important, and this kind of the dossiers we can annually prepare, and we try to expose the Indians at the international forums. I do understand in this real world, these forums have a lesser significance if we start looking with the narratives, because generally I do understand as a student of international relations that the priority in the state's policies is always military objectives, then economics, and then these values and norms come. Definitely the dossier is at the third level of the attraction, but still we
Right.
have to exercise this.
Right. Thank you for joining us. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Jan Lodi, pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for your time. Dr. Jaspal, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time. That is all from today's dialogue. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next time. Khuda Hafiz.